Ah, the American four-wheel drive. So capable, so bold. These continent climbers like the Ford Bronco and Jeep Wrangler have been dominating the trails and mall parking lots since 1945. Many people think that the father of American four-wheel drive is the Willys MB, the World War II icon that was built in the hundreds of thousands and served in every theater of the war. But if the Willys is the father of four-wheel drive, then the Jeffery Quad is the grandfather. But before we talk about the Jeffery Quad, we need to paint a picture of what the American road situation was like in the early 1900s. And to put it bluntly, it sucked. Really bad. In fact, it was so bad that a 1904 report showed that over the 2 million miles of road, only about 150,000 miles were quote unquote improved in any way. Improved meaning surface with gravel or other materials. What this meant practically is that the majority of roads connecting towns were a combination of dirt, sand, and mud. Mud being the real killer. It was so bad that cars and wagons would be up to their hubs in the mud fighting forward with axes, picks, and pulleys and anything else they could get their hands on for traction. This 1897 quote from the League of American Wheelmen sums up the problem nicely. Quote, "Mud is king. Business is paralyzed. Many millions of dollars are sunk in mud holes every year. Millions of people are made unhappy by a mud-enforced isolation. Horses and vehicles are ruined. How much longer are mud roads going to curse our country?" Pretty dramatic stuff. But it wasn't just farmers and motorists who saw this as an issue. The US Army too had begun to realize that their logistics, consisting primarily of horses and mules, would not be sufficient for modern warfare, and in 1912 they approached the Thomas B. Jeffery Company to build the ultimate truck. The Thomas B. Jeffery Company, named after, you guessed it, Thomas B. Jeffery, was founded in 1902 after Jeffery had sold his interest in a bicycle firm that he had founded. The prototypes that the brand introduced first were actually pretty sophisticated. The Model A prototype sported a steering wheel and a front engine layout, which doesn't sound all that crazy, but opposed to the tiller-steered hidden engine variety that was so common in the early 1900s, this was a fairly novel car. Production for Jeffery would begin in 1902, and the cars would be sold under the Rambler name. Yes, that Rambler. Like many other brands such as Oldsmobile, the Rambler would slowly move up market, making bigger and bigger touring cars such as the Rambler Model 63, a late brass era car that I think, along with the Pope Hartford, is among the best looking for the time, but let me know what you think. In 1910, Thomas B. Jeffery would pass away while in Italy. The company would carry on till the Rambler name was dropped in 1915 at the request of Thomas's son Charles to honor his father's legacy. The branding would change again when in 1916 a disgruntled GM executive who had been fighting with GM president William Durant would buy the company outright. His name was Charles Nash, and within a year or so the Thomas B. Jeffery Company would be renamed to Nash Motors. And Nash as a brand would exist till the company would merge with Hudson to form American Motors in 1954. Okay, so we know that the roads are bad and that a company named after a dead guy is going to build them a truck. What were the government requirements for such a truck then? Well, the truck had to be able to move loads anywhere that a four-mule team could. It had to have a cargo capacity of 1.5 tons with a 20% overload capacity, and it had to be made affordably, be reliable, and serviceable. And in less than a year after the initial request, Jeffery had a working prototype. And boy, did the Jeffery deliver. Not only would the quad meet these requirements, the final product would sport four-wheel drive, four-wheel steering, which allowed the truck to circle in 44 feet, four-wheel braking, a rarity in this era, and the ability to ford 34 inches of water, and locking front and rear differentials. And on top of it, the wheels it used were bullet resistant. After some initial testing, the quad would be pressed into service with the first trucks being used on the Mexican border in late 1913. In my opinion, the quad is kind of ugly. Really, it's just an engine atop some frame rails. Out front of the truck is a massive radiator, flanked by comically small kerosene or electric headlights. The steel wheels look pretty cool though, and I'm sure provided more reliable service than wooden wheels that were still on most cars. The quad wasn't going to win any styling contest. In fact, the only styling I see on the whole truck is the small quad emblem above the radiator. But despite its Spartan appearance, the quad weighed a whopping 8,300 pounds and was powered by a 21 horsepower Buddha engine. With less than optimal power to weight ratio, this beast topped out at around 14 miles an hour. Slow, but faster than a team of mules. But its lowest gear ratio was an extreme 43.2 to 1, meaning the quad could pull just about anything at the time. It just wasn't going to get anywhere fast. Once the quad went into production, the marketing team of Jeffery went nuts. Appearing all over the country were newspapers and magazine ads touting the superiority of the quad. Images began to appear of the quad fording through mud and water. Farmers, loggers, and road workers gave their testimonials about how great this truck was. Quote, "We have had the quad running continuously over rough roads, steep hills, and in the mud. The truck has stood the test where several other trucks working in the same conditions were unable to do the work." Jeffery even staged an impressive show where the quad was driven up and parked on a 49% grade. There was even now a lost 8-minute video of the quad titled "Through the Enemy's Lines," showing the quad doing cool off-road truck stuff. Soon the term super truck began to float around, and the marketing worked. In its first year of production, over 2,000 quads left the factory. The quad was becoming a legend, but its story had just begun. Unfortunately for the world, Europe, about the same time the quad went into production, decided to blow itself up over some royalty or something in the Balkans. I don't know. What this meant for Jeffery was that the rugged Army spec quad was suddenly in sky-high demand, and Jeffery/Nash was more than willing to cooperate. Soon, thousands of orders began to flood in for the quad, all in different specs. In Russia, the Army would order an armored quad for vehicle maintenance and recovery, named the Shardyev, something like that, or Wizard. The quad would quickly prove itself as a capable vehicle on and off-road in testing, and 30 more would be ordered. The batch of 30 so-called Papa Lavko quads were armed with Maxim machine guns and had a covered driver's compartment with a low rear bed. The Russian Revolution would end shipments from Jeffery, but the quads would continue to see service with the Russians before, during, and after the revolution on both sides, and with armies that captured the quads like Germany and Poland. It is even rumored that some quads were still in service in Eastern Europe as late as World War II. Quads were popping up all over the world. An armored quad was seen in Mexico chasing the Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa, and another in Haiti. Up and down French and British lines were convoys of quads fighting among the trenches. All throughout World War I, quads served as troop carriers, mobile machine shops, artillery trucks, armored cars, and anything else the armies of the Allies might need. By the end of the war, it's estimated that over 20,000 were made, a number so high that Nash was making more trucks than cars. But all good things have to come to an end. Soon the war would be over and demand for quads would plummet. After the war, the Nash quad would disappear from the bombastic ads that defined it earlier. As the 1920s would roll on, most Nash ads would only briefly mention the, quote, famous quad, and by 1928, the end was near. Nash had moved away from truck production, and it looks like the quad was one of the last holdouts for the firm. The last quads apparently were exported to Pakistan to work on their tough roads. All in all, as many as 40,000 quads were made by Jeffery, Nash, and subcontractors. A pretty impressive figure for such a niche and ultimately expensive vehicle. But even 20 plus years later, into the 1950s, the old Nash and Jeffery quads were still being used with logging and construction companies. Not ready to give up their quads, these trucks would be run into the ground by men who loved them. But time would take its toll, and they would finally vanish from the work sites they were built for. The quad is largely forgotten today. Four-wheel drive trucks are easy to come by, and Jeeps infest all corners of this country. But the quad was remarkable during its time. It fought with distinction. It earned a reputation for being unkillable and almost impossible to get stuck. It didn't really invent anything, but it did everything right. It was slow, heavy, and ugly, but beautiful in its role as a super truck.